that was a lot. This is a double portion. That's why it's a lot. I think kind of where I started when I was looking at this portion and what I'd like to do kind of with it today. We understand that God didn't divide this all up the way we've divided it, you know. But for us, it is the end of a book. We're coming to the end of a division as we've made it up. So I'd like to actually just kind of start there and it's still going. I was like, I'm hearing this little voice down here. It's actually still playing.
It's in your head.
Yeah, I'm hearing voice. Luckily, I'm hearing the Bible. That's okay. I
Yeah.
guess I'm not going to hear voices. Shush. But just a really quick. I mean, obviously, we start out with Bereshit. In beginning.
No, John?
Period. Period. Then Shemot, Exodus. Then the names. In the beginning, the names that he called Vayikra, Leviticus, and were to in the wilderness, the Midbar. Okay, where we've seen what he did to establish. We are given the history of a people. We're given the laws that are to govern those people, and now we're shown the beginning stages of where they are to actually, I guess you could say, enter into their promise. You know, we're right at the doorstep. We're about to get to the doorstep of where they're about to achieve what he promised them obviously on one level. So there's a lot of things that we're about to make that transition. You know, we're about to see where all this wandering, all these people, as we call it again, sometimes I wonder how we come up with our translations, but the numbers, where and then I guess looking at numbers, you know, started to take it from macro down to micro again, you know. We start out with counting, and in ways we end up with counting, you know. So I mean, I guess I understand why we call it numbers. There's some real interesting. There's some real distinct things that are covered in all of this. I was reading some kind of interesting commentaries. We start out in the first part in 30. We talk about we call it vows, or making an oath, making a vow. I read some interesting stuff though, that the word in Hebrew for vow is different than this word nader that's used in this sense here. And that traditionally, sometimes it's almost like Jews will make a vow, but then they'll cover it with this bela neder or bechla neder, and saying, but I don't want to make it a nader, just in case something happens and I can't fulfill this. They kind of cover themselves, you know. But I think it's really interesting because the word itself, I think, has the same depth, if you will, that we put to the word Shema. You know, we kind of give Shema just a listen as a blanket word, but we know there's a lot more depth to that word Shema Israel. they're supposed to do a lot more with that word than just listen. So I think, you know, and what's covered here is obviously the vows that a woman, every vow, but then more specifically, the vows that a woman or a young girl makes in her father's home. Traditionally, they say before the age of 12 or bat mitzvah, I believe, I guess would be the distinction. And how the father can take precedence if he's responsible,
He's always
which is a really,
responsible. He's always responsible,
Well,
especially to the.
Yeah, but it should be, but some of us are irresponsible, is my point. That's the where I'm going with responsible. Because obviously, if he hears his daughter make a vow and says nothing, she's bound by that vow because he hasn't covered her.
He's responsible, right?
Well, I guess he bears some responsibility, but she's held to that vow. Okay? Same thing with the husband. If he hears something and doesn't respond to it the first time he hears it, then he's responsible for not covering his bride. And one of the things that I thought was interesting that I read back to is they compare this, they bring this back all the way to Genesis 3:19 or 3:16, where, you know, God is talking to Eve and saying, okay, and your pain in childbirth will be, and you will look towards your husband, and he will rule over you. Okay, in the sense that element that a ruler can be responsible, is responsible for those that are underneath him. Even if you go to if nothing else, to the feudal system, you know, there was the king, and he had all his vassals, but ultimately he was responsible for the protection of all those. That's what made it all work, was that he took responsibility for them, to protect them and things like that. So from that same standpoint, but I think it's important to understand that they do talk about the difference between an oath and this, because there's another word, shahaim or something.
Shavua.
Shavua?
Yeah.
Shavua, for like an oath that you can. Wait, I take it back. It's not as strong.
Right.
It's not the same thing as nader. Go ahead.
I think that this is really cool because there's a lot of parallels here between what Yeshua teaches in the Gospels regarding vows and regarding leadership and kingship in this parsha, right? And so you talked about how the leaders sometimes of people, right, are not responsible.
Right.
But what Yeshua does when he teaches his disciples about leadership and about ruling over people, he says, the lords of the Gentiles, you know, rule and they lord it over them. But so shall it not be among you. Whoever wants to be your servant, whoever wants to be first among you, must become his servant.
Which inherently there's a responsibility there, acceptance of a responsibility.
Right, there is.
Yeah.
And that's actually something that's something that we see that is very actually characteristic of not just the Messiah himself, but of someone who is reigning and ruling according to the decrees of the Father.
Well, I'm glad you went there, because see, one of the things too that I saw, and especially going back to 3:16, Genesis 3:16, and making this correlation between the prototypical man and wife, if you will, with Adam and Eve. I do think I ascribe to the concept that Adam is responsible for headship
Right.
with Eve, and Eve is responsible for protecting the family and that whole unit. And I think it absolutely fits here. And I think God speaks to it here. In the same sense that just like Yeshua is our head, we are responsible to protect his headship. And he rules over us. And actually there was this, I was thinking about it, it's like there was this great deal of hope that he knows the scripture. He is a responsible father, husband. Okay? So I think about it, I go, Lord, maybe I have no idea how many times you've covered me. When I've made a vow as your son or your wife to be,
Right.
and you have said, no.
Right.
Because I know he hears everything the first time.
Right.
Go ahead.
One of the things that we see in this parsha, and I learned this actually from the commentary that I was reading, and I didn't catch this, but it speaks of a wife making a vow twice in the parsha, under two separate conditions. The first time that it speaks of a wife making a vow is as a woman who is betrothed and not yet in the house of her husband.
Right?
Okay? And when she does so, her father is actually the one that has the responsibility of annulling that vow.
Right?
Okay? But at the point where she's been brought into her husband's house, ultimately then her husband is responsible for annulling the vow. But think of it this way, okay? In the sense that in the sense of being betrothed,
Right?
right, to the Messiah, to God,
Right.
ultimately we are not yet in his house,
Right?
right? Because ultimately creation itself has not yet been perfected to the point where he can dwell amongst us.
Now, but your implication is the difference between we're under Yod He Vav He's control and headship at this point,
Right.
and in a future day we will be under our Yeshua's
Well,
headship
I mean, as
when that's consummated.
with Yeshua as his representative.
Of course,
You know?
of course.
And the thing is that right now, because we don't have the authority figure here amongst us in that way to nullify our vows on our behalf,
Hmm.
many of us are suffering the consequences of vows that we've made, without thinking.
I think that's probably legitimate. I'm sure a lot of us could
In
attest to it.
Ecclesiastes 5, verse 4 says, "When you make a vow to God, do not be late in paying it. For he takes no delight in fools, pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Do not let your speech cause you to sin, and do not say in the presence of the messenger of God that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry on account of your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For many dreams and in many words there is emptiness. Rather fear God." I think that goes, hand in hand with it.
Mhm.
And not making vows directly to God and be like,
Right.
"Oh, I'm sorry, God, I didn't mean it," when something comes up.
And it's crazy, like Yeshua adds even a stringency to that, He even tells us, it says in Matthew, it says, "Again you have heard that it is written to the first ones, you shall not swear falsely, but you shall perform your oaths to the Lord. Yet I say to you, you shall not swear any oath, not by heaven, for it is the throne of God, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Not even by the life of your own head shall you swear, since you are unable to turn one hair black or white. Instead, let your words be yes, yes, no, no. Anything beyond this is from the evil one."
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I think it almost sounds here that there's at least there's this element initially where you could look at this as being some great Hebrew legalism. Okay, well he's responsible and he can nullify this I actually read one commentary that this is a part that Jewish feminists don't really like, but obviously they don't see it. I think it helps to see the equality that's established.
Right.
It doesn't mean be quiet, don't make any vows. It just says that you're covered. Now I don't know what happens to. I guess I would say I don't know what happens to young boys, that they're not covered by anything. But other than, if you will, I think it's good to look at this relationship and say, Well, yeah, everyone is actually covered in that sense. There is somebody listening to you, huh?
Widows are not covered.
Well, widows and divorcees but except, I would say, the same way that men are covered, as being the bride. That would be the only, I think, it's why I kind of like that sense of still being covered as his bride. Maybe a future
So we
covering.
are covered by Yeshua?
Oh, I would say so. I mean, again, it's like,
Well, and that was something that puzzled me, because there in verse 9, it says, "But every vow of a widow and of her that is divorced, wherewith they have bound their souls, shall stand against her. And if she," and this is what gets me, because he's talking about widows and divorced women, but, widows. "And if she vowed in her husband's house, or bound her soul by a bond with an oath, and her husband heard it," how's he
Right.
gonna hear it?
right.
That's a different thing there, I think.
It went straight from
Well,
widowhood
Yeah, but it's
straight
another,
into that.
it's another paragraph.
No, well, I mean, in English, there's a semicolon between 10 and 11. Oh, excuse me, between 10 and 11. There is a period between 9 and 10, though.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's a different paragraph.
Well, I guess I don't have a paragraph, but, okay. So anyway, I mean, I think the idea of a vow, and obviously they talk about a nader. It is what's considered in a Nazarite vow. It's that same, not severity, but that's not the word I want.
It has the same weight.
Weight, thank you.
Yeah.
The same weight, which is much better than severity. Was a much more understandable example of a nader. Go ahead.
One of the things that I think is really cool that it brings down is that one of the things that it says here, and it's actually really interesting, the language that this is in verse 14, any vow and any oath prohibition that cause personal affliction, her husband may uphold it, and her husband may nullify it. And it actually kind of qualifies the type of vow. And it actually, I think it demonstrates that, a woman still definitely has a certain level of spiritual responsibility towards herself regarding the vows that she speaks. But as it comes to how they may affect her physically, if it's something that she's vowed to, like, afflict herself or afflict her soul, what have you,
Right, because they do talk about
her husband
affliction,
can
yeah.
step in and say, I don't think that's a good idea.
Mhm.
You're going to harm yourself.
Well, you're not trying to say that women are much more dramatic than we are when do things like that, would they? I am not doing this until this happens. Wait a minute.
Women are much more level-headed.
Yes, ma'am.
I think it's beautiful the way he described it, like a marriage, a relationship, getting married. But he's talking about us. It's like when you're married, when you do something, you had a vow. Be careful what you're doing. The same with God. Be careful. It's Him. You're in His footstool. You're going to hurt your relationship with Him, like your relationship.
You're going to
with marriage.
affect, you're definitely going to affect it. Yeah.
Man or woman, I think, a man can unconsciously think, man, what we do? And all of a sudden, hey, both, things, both, you have to be careful. But with a woman, I think, because we're more emotional and men are practical, but you're supposed to be our leader. I'm supposed to look up to you as my spouse. You know? I'm
There's
supposed to
different
respect
level
you.
of
Please don't
discernment
let me
usually.
lose my respect for you, and we can't do nothing about it. We have to wait for God to make up for what error we did as a woman or a man.
Mhm.
And we have to be very careful in God's house. Our relationship, because the devil's ready for that little door to be open, and he's there. Separation.
What about a divorcee that gets remarried? And she made a vow before she got remarried. She's no longer a divorcee or a
There's
widow.
nothing, I mean, technically in my reading, there's nothing her current husband can do about that vow.
1 Corinthians chapter 7 kind of touches on that.
Okay?
A a widow or a divorcee getting remarried, as Paul's saying, it's better to stay unmarried unless you absolutely can't, because it's better to get married than have the burning sexual desires.
They say, what is it, anywhere between 20 and 50 or something like that, 60 for a woman. If your husband dies in that period of time, or if, you should get married again so that you can be in someone else's covering again. Otherwise,
5 years to go.
after that point, then it's the kahal, it's the congregation that is responsible for your covering.
So, would your new husband, whether you were divorced or widow, have the right to cancel out what the woman vowed before?
I mean, I don't
When
think
the
so.
husband dies, the vow would die.
And, but there's also something else in there that says that if the husband doesn't disavow it right away,
That's
and
my
then
point.
disavows it later, then he is responsible.
He's responsible for it.
Okay, so then that would be an out for you getting remarried, because then he would disavow it later.
It says the husband should give his wife all that he owes her as his wife, and the wife should give her husband all that she owes him as her husband. And then it says that they share.
That's where?
They share the body.
First Corinthians?
1 Corinthians chapter 7. It talks about them sharing because they're no longer one, or they're no longer two, they
Two,
become
there's
one.
one.
And because of so much sin, there's so much divorce and so much confusion. And I feel God's telling us to have that relationship, be careful not to break it with me. Because, what good is it for me to divorce and marry this guy, but if he's not a man of God, it's no bueno, no, it's void. He has to be a leader a servant of the Lord. He has to love God more than, more than myself.
We may be here till 9 o'clock.
Yeah, no,
That's our society now.
yeah, I mean, I would caution us to try and draw too much sense out of our present situation in the world, because it's pretty askew.
And some people marry Christians. And you think that they left Christians the way you did.
Well, yeah, but you've already set the situation up by calling them Christian people, and we already would agree that they don't necessarily,
Oh, my God.
that doesn't necessarily differentiate them much from the world sometimes. But, okay, so that's pretty much the majority of what we get in 30. Then we go back and we revisit Midian, and the Lord telling Moses, okay, listen, you need to finish this, and it needs to be complete. You need to take Midian out, basically. And I thought it was,
You gotta wonder, what was Moses thinking when God told him, go in and destroy the Midianites? That was his family.
yeah.
Midian was his family. Midianites were,
Moses' family?
yes.
He
You
married
know,
a Midianite woman.
Oh, well.
It's one of the things that one of the comments that I read, that I think it really, it touches on what you're talking about there, because again, you're talking about him dealing with his people of sorts.
Not her, but his wives.
Yeah, his wives.
Yeah.
Does that mean we can kill our in-law?
No. But what we do is we see some resolution though. We've seen the people who last were the biggest problem and stumbling block for Israel, his people. Okay? They were there, they called up Balaam, come and curse them. Okay, can't do that, but here we are, we're trying to do this. Here's how we're going to do it. And then here we get the resolution of it, where the Lord actually does deal with it all and goes, okay, listen, you need to take them out. And in the process, we see Balaam also gets taken out with this group.
It gave the impression earlier that Balaam left and went back home. So obviously the impression wasn't what really happened, either that or he came back.
I'm not. Where did I
Where
would
was
be?
Midian
Where
his
did you? Where do you see where he went? He went home.
It said that he would,
It says that he
it
went
said that
home.
he would go home.
Okay.
Didn't say that he did go home.
Yeah, no, see, I would say, yeah, he could.
He gave
I
the
think he got
impression
his,
that.
I think he got his silver and his gold and, I think he got rewarded.
And it's even taught that despite the fact that Balaam couldn't curse the children of Israel, he still, before it was all over, he still found a way to try to get them to stumble.
Oh, he did curse
By,
them.
Yeah.
by
Yeah, they
sending
did. And they
Midianite
did.
women to them.
And
Yeah,
that's what
he
he's
set up
talking
And
his
that's
about.
what
curse.
he's talking about here in
Yeah.
31.
It's like he
Right.
still found a way, even
And
though,
that's the reason they
Yeah.
should have
you know,
killed the women too.
so I mean, ultimately, we know
So, yeah,
his
they
intention
probably
was
still
not
did pay him.
Oh, I think, I'm sure he got paid. He got,
He said, I can't curse them, but I can tell you how to.
Right, exactly.
How they can
Cause them
how they'll
curse
curse themselves.
Themselves, yeah,
He sent them Midianite women.
yeah, exactly, yeah.
I don't think it was any coincidence that they were led, weren't they? They were led by Phineas, right? Who was zealous for the Lord in killing the Midianitish woman.
Same reason.
So he had no problem with doing what needed to be done here. Then obviously we see that they didn't kind of do what needed to be done. And Moses
They didn't keep their vows.
comes back and he's going, what are you doing? This is like, we actually didn't have a problem with the men. We had a problem with the women that were, our stumbling block. And so, now, this isn't actually, it's spoken of before, right, where we hear what to do with, if you want to take a woman and you have to keep her out of the whatever, outside the camp for 30 days and
30 days,
let her
shave her
mourn
head,
and do all that stuff, shave her head and all that kind of things. It's not actually done here, but they've already been given, basically they've been given the rules on what to do in this situation. So they pretty much wiped out everything, but, probably the 20 to 60-year-old virgins, I don't know. Is it possible? Say, yeah, it's been set up before.
But
We know it's been
that's
set
what
up.
causes me though, is the fact that they could keep the women that were not, had never seen a man, because they were not supposed to intermarry. And that kind of puzzled me that they would be allowed
I
to
think
do
that's
that.
what the 30-day captivity was, because surely, they're not just gonna do this to those women,
Right.
shave their heads, cut their fingernails, and throw them off in a room somewhere. Somebody's gonna be there teaching them, and I'll bet it was the widows,
I think that's, well, we know that
the older women.
they're supposed to. I mean, that's part of what
And
that
tell
you
them,
do as a
look,
woman. Yeah.
right.
this is what is going to be done.
Right.
We're gonna teach you our ways, and if you
Right.
choose to follow our God, things will be well with you.
Right.
If not, you'll lose your life, baby. Come
And I
on.
think the Torah is that because
You hear me say
the
that
only
all
ones
the
that
time.
weren't kept alive were the ones who not slept with a man.
Right.
And so, I mean, obviously that shows that they had at least the proper intention.
And they didn't already have a covering.
Intention to begin with.
They really didn't already have a covering.
Right.
Why kill all the male children?
Did they not have?
Because they,
Again, it's lineage.
They would avenge their
Yeah,
their
they
father's
would avenge
deaths.
their fathers.
It's
When they
really
find out.
because they trace, they're so patrilineal in this sense that,